I'm not sure how to start, to be honest, but well, here I go. Dan and I met in college, the summer after my sophomore year. I was studying hard for my degree in education, while he seemed to coast effortlessly through his business courses, always with a smile on his face and a charm that drew people to him. I noticed him from the very first day of freshman year. He was funny, outgoing, and ridiculously easy to talk to. He had this energy about him that I couldn't resist. And yet, there was something about him that intrigued me more than anything else. We began dating shortly after that first encounter. It was easy, natural even. We had a lot in common, but also enough differences to keep things interesting. He always had a way of making me laugh when I felt stressed about school. When I was in my senior year, I knew I was falling in love with him. By the time we graduated, we were inseparable. We decided to move to Franklin, Tennessee, where we built a life together. After 6 years of dating, we married. It felt right, like everything had led up to that moment. 2 years into our marriage, life felt stable. Dan worked from home in digital marketing, which gave him a flexible schedule, while I was the head of the most prestigious school in the city. My job was demanding, but I loved it. Dan, on the other hand, was content in his work. He was good at what he did, and he didn't seem to need much else. But somewhere in the daily grind, I felt something starting to change between us. I couldn't quite pinpoint it at first. We still spent time together, but I noticed how distant Dan had become when we were alone. The late-night conversations that had once been the cornerstone of our relationship began to disappear. And I, ever so focused on my career, let the distance grow without questioning it too much. Then, during the summer, my twin sister Rose came to visit. Rose had always been the free spirit to my more serious nature. She was my mirror in so many ways. We looked alike, we even laughed the same, but she was different in the way she lived her life. While I thrived in a structured environment, Rose had always followed her own path. She had been living in Canada for a few years and was sick of the cold weather, so she decided to spend a few months with us. I was excited to have her around. Rose and I had always been close, even though our lives had drifted in different directions. She was warm, charismatic, and full of life. Dan immediately got along with her. They both had a shared love for the outdoors, and their spontaneous nature made them a perfect match for hikes, workouts, and social events. At first, it was great. Rose was the breath of fresh air I didn't know we needed. She brought energy into the house that we'd both been missing. But soon, I started noticing how much time she and Dan were spending together. They would go to the gym in the mornings, have lunch together, and even start working on some side projects. I was busy with my demanding role as a principal, so I didn't think much of it at first. But as the weeks passed, I began to feel unsettled. Dan seemed more alive when he was with Rose, and I couldn't help but feel like I was slowly being pushed aside. There was no reason for my suspicion, or at least, I told myself that, but something about their connection felt different, deeper. I tried to ignore it. But I could see the small, subtle signs that something was happening between them. It wasn't anything overt. There were no obvious signs of affection, no open flirting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their friendship than I realized. Dan had always been affectionate with me, but now, when we were together, his touches felt distant. His eyes weren't as focused on me. Rose, on the other hand, was always cheerful and playful around Dan, always bringing out the best in him. And I couldn't help but notice how much more they had in common than I did with him. She was carefree, spontaneous, and unburdened by responsibility, the complete opposite of me. It was as if they fit together in a way that we no longer did. It was an ordinary evening, or at least that's what I tried to convince myself. The air in the house felt heavy as I returned from work. I had been running late, dealing with a multitude of crises at the school, but it didn't stop me from trying to keep up the appearances of a normal night. I had planned to make dinner for all three of us, Rose, Dan, and myself. I wanted to make everything feel like it was still okay. I wanted to hold on to what we had. When I opened the door, the sound of laughter reached my ears. It was Rose and Dan, chatting in the living room, but something about it felt off. They were too close. Their conversation wasn't just light-hearted banter. It was full of warmth and something else. My heart skipped a beat, and I paused in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. They hadn't noticed me yet. I could see them from behind. Rose was standing just a bit too close to Dan. Their heads were tilted toward each other, and their laughter had a touch of something deeper. I felt a chill creep up my spine. It was as if I were watching them through a veil, as if I didn't belong there anymore. The feeling in my gut was unbearable. I wanted to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I stayed, frozen, observing them in silence. The air was thick with tension, and I knew in that moment, something had changed. They were different with each other now. And as I stood there, quietly suffering, I couldn't escape the harsh truth. The connection between them was no longer just friendly. There was something more. I couldn't breathe. When they finally noticed me standing there, Dan smiled nervously. "Hey, babe. You're home early," he said, his voice unusually strained. I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, I thought I'd surprise you too." My voice wavered slightly. I couldn't help it. Rose flashed me a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was an awkwardness hanging between us, like we were all pretending everything was fine when we all knew it wasn't. It wasn't just the conversation. It was their body language, the way they moved around each other, their glances. I made dinner that night in a daze. The food tasted bland, as if I could no longer enjoy anything. The three of us ate together, but the silence in the room was deafening. I wanted to scream, to ask them what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. What was there to say? I already knew. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a fog. Everything seemed normal, but it wasn't. The guilt between Dan and Rose was suffocating. We were all living in a house that felt too small for our emotions. Every smile between them felt forced. I saw the way Rose would touch Dan's arm, the way they would laugh at inside jokes that didn't include me. I noticed everything. Every touch, every glance, every subtle moment of intimacy. It wasn't normal anymore. But nothing prepared me for that one night. I had been working late again. The school year was winding down, and my responsibilities were weighing on me. When I came home, the house was dimly lit. I assumed Dan and Rose were just watching TV. I walked through the living room, but the scene I walked into stopped me cold. Dan and Rose were in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the intensity in the air was impossible to ignore. I could hear the faint sound of their conversation, but it wasn't the words that made my blood run cold. It was the silence that followed. A charged, lingering pause. And then, I saw it. Rose leaned in slowly, her hands resting lightly on Dan's chest. He didn't pull away. In fact, he leaned in, and before I could stop myself, I watched them kiss. It was slow, almost painful to witness. The kiss was deep, and it held none of the innocence I had once seen between them. It was the kiss of two people who had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, frozen, as my whole world crumbled around me. The pain in my chest was so sharp, so immediate, it felt like I was suffocating. They didn't even know I was there, not until the silence was broken by my sharp intake of breath. They pulled away, their eyes wide with shock. Dan's face was full of guilt, but Rose looked like she had no remorse at all. "Kathy," Dan started, his voice weak, but I couldn't hear the rest. I turned and walked out of the room, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I felt like the ground was slipping from beneath me, like I was falling into some kind of abyss. I locked myself in the bedroom, unable to stop the tears. My body shook with sobs, and for the first time, I realized that I had lost both my husband and my sister. There was no going back. There was no fixing this. The next few days were filled with a kind of silence I had never experienced before. Dan tried to talk to me, but his words were empty. Rose avoided me as much as possible. I could feel the weight of their guilt pressing down on all of us, but it wasn't enough to heal what had been broken. The worst part: they still acted like nothing had changed. Dan still slept beside me at night, but it was hollow. There was nothing real left in our bed. When I closed my eyes, all I could see was the image of them kissing, the tenderness they shared that I no longer had with him. I knew I couldn't stay like this. But the more I tried to confront them, the more they seemed to pull away. They were so caught up in their own secret world that they didn't even notice the destruction they were leaving in their wake. One night, I had had enough. I walked into the living room where they were sitting, pretending that everything was fine, and I demanded the truth. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Dan's face paled, and Rose looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. Dan opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. It was like they were both frozen in time, too afraid to face the reality of what they had done. "I don't want to hear excuses," I continued, the anger building in my chest. "You both knew what you were doing. And yet, you did it anyway." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but it was too late for apologies. "I'm sorry, Kathy," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." The words stung, but I couldn't say anything in return. The betrayal had already cut too deep. The truth was now undeniable, and the emotional weight of it all began to suffocate me. The pain of knowing that Dan had fallen for my sister was unbearable. How could I ever trust him again? How could I ever look at Rose the same way? Dan tried to explain himself, but the words didn't matter. I'm sorry, Kathy. I never meant for this to happen. I love you, he said, but his voice was hollow. But the love he had for me was no longer enough. The betrayal had taken root deep in my heart, and I could feel it poisoning every memory I had of us. His apology meant nothing to me. It was too late. You've already made your choice, I said, my voice trembling but resolute. And so have I. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized that I couldn't stay. My heart felt like it had been ripped in two. I loved Dan, but I could never forgive him for what he had done. The woman he had chosen was not me, it was Rose, the one person I trusted more than anyone else. With every ounce of strength I had left, I packed my bags. Dan and Rose were in the other room, pretending not to hear. They didn't even come to stop me. They didn't try to explain. I had become a stranger in my own home, a woman abandoned by both the love of her life and her own flesh and blood. As I stepped out of the door, the weight of my decision hit me like a ton of bricks. But I knew it was the only choice I had left. I had to leave them behind and find a way to heal. But as I walked away, a voice inside me whispered, I will never be the same again.
If you like this story and felt connected, please subscribe. Thanks for watching Gabby's cheating stories. See you on the next one.